Mary, Queen of Scots, was a woman who was almost literally a queen from birth. For much of her life, she was seen as the binding contract of a friendship between Scotland and France, and for the rest, she was a problem for her religion and the threat she posed to the English throne. But it was one event that would dramatically twist the reins of power from her hands forever, and it is that event that this video looks at in detail: the murder of her second husband, Lord Darnley, and the aftermath. Mary was very unusual in that when she was born on the 8th of December 1542, her father, James V of Scotland, was already ill from either cholera or dysentery, and he died just 6 days after her birth, making her Queen of Scots before she was even a week old. However, she also came from a long line of child monarchs, beginning with James I of Scotland, her 3 times great-grandfather. Due to her young age, her childhood reign was dominated by regents, including her mother, Mary of Guise. Her mother came from the powerful Guise family who were in favour with the French monarch Henry II, and this would have a bearing on young Mary's future. When she was around 8 months old, the Treaty of Greenwich was signed between England and Scotland on the 1st of July 1543. This included a plan by Henry VIII that England and Scotland should eventually be united in some fashion, and part of this was the agreed betrothal between Mary and Henry's son, Prince Edward. However, the truth was that Scotland's government and royal family both favoured a connection with the French, and of course, the English absolutely wanted to prevent this. Therefore, James Hamilton, Earl of Arran, who was at the time regent, moved very slowly on the marriage. When it became clear what was really happening, and Henry arrested some Scottish nobles and impounded their goods, it kicked off a series of wars that would become known as the Rough Wooing. It was a name that hid the true devastation and violence of the conflicts. By 1547, Scotland wanted assistance, and France promised to deliver it in exchange for Mary's betrothal to the young Dauphin, Francis. It was agreed upon, and at just 5 years old, young Mary set off with her own court from Dumbarton on the 7th of August 1548 for Brittany. She would spend the next 13 years of her life in France. She charmed all at the French court and was praised for being a clever and vivacious child, and as she grew older, beauty was added to that list too. As befitting a queen, Mary was taught how to play both the lute and the virginals, the 2 most popular instruments at the time. She knew how to read, write and study poetry. As with her contemporary Elizabeth I, she knew many languages and was taught her native tongue of Scots alongside French, Italian, Latin, Spanish and Greek, as well as horsemanship, falconry, dancing, sewing and needlework. We even have a very good idea of what she looked like, both from contemporary portraits and descriptions. Mary would end up very tall for a woman of her time at 5 foot 11 inches and was considered strikingly beautiful as an adult with auburn hair, hooded hazel brown eyes, smooth skin and an elegant neck, and was noted for being very eloquent. In a twist of fate, her future husband Francis would end up quite short with a stutter. On the 4th of April 1558, Mary signed a secret agreement that if she died without having children, both the Scottish throne and her claim to the English crown would pass to France. On the 24th, just a few weeks later, she married the Dauphin at Notre Dame. In November of that year, the death of Queen Mary I of England meant that there was a shift in politics across Europe. In the eyes of many Catholics, her true heir should have been Mary through Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, but instead, her Protestant sister Elizabeth I took the throne. This would be the roots of a conflict that would end with Mary of Scots' head on a chopping block many years later. The following year, Henri II died on the 10th of July 1559 in a jousting accident, leaving his 15-year-old son Francis to become king. Mary was now Queen of France and Queen of Scots. Despite many later accounts making out Mary did not get on well with her formidable mother-in-law Catherine de' Medici, she actually did. She was a source of comfort for Catherine after Henri died, and the two women would often spend time together at prayers or dinner while Francis went out hunting. Francis was a difficult person to spend time with, as due to his general ill health he was often violent and bad-tempered. But he wouldn't be around for long either. He got ill later in 1560 with a severe abscess in his ear, and by the 5th of December it had taken his life, along with the other ailments that he had suffered since childhood. Mary was no longer Queen of France, and her brother-in-law, Charles IX, took the throne at just 10 years old, with his mother Catherine acting as regent alongside the Guise family. 9 months later, Mary returned to Scotland, a place that must have seemed foreign to her after spending most of her life so far in France. While she was no doubt told about the complex political situation in Scotland, it was another thing to actually experience it firsthand. When she had left at 5, Scotland, including its nobles, had been mostly Catholic. But by the time she returned, a strong Protestant faction also existed, led by her illegitimate half-brother James Stuart, the Earl of Moray. As a result, Mary was viewed with suspicion by many in Scotland, and she had a similar problem to England in that her country was divided into Catholics and Protestants. But unlike Mary I of England or Elizabeth I, she did not implement a standard religion for Scotland, and instead tolerated both factions existing. This angered both sides, and the Catholics were especially put out that she also kept her half-brother Moray as her chief advisor. It wasn't a bad move. We can see that she likely considered it would keep everyone happy if they had a Catholic queen with a Protestant advisor who was also her relative. Her Privy Council was also made up of 16 men who had retained their offices for a long time, and many of them, again, were Protestant. And worse than this, many of them had been leaders during the Protestant Reformation crisis of 1559-60. Some historians consider this was Mary admitting she couldn't face another Protestant uprising militarily on her own, and that she may have been focused on the English throne over the internal problems of Scotland. She would have found Scotland a very different prospect to France. The country as a whole was poorer, including the nobles, and there was constant infighting amongst them. This infighting was a result of clan arguing and several generations of marriage between clans, and the separate areas under the control of each noble was treated almost as a separate principality. As a result, they did not appreciate the monarch taking too keen an interest and wanted to be able to rule their areas without interference. Either way, as a young queen without heirs, Mary had to consider remarrying. While still in France, she had considered marrying Carlos, Prince of Asturias, the eldest son and heir of Philip II. But her ex-mother-in-law Catherine's daughter had just married the Spanish king, and Catherine didn't want her daughter overshadowed by the presence of Mary, suggesting instead she return to Scotland. But with her huge French dowry and Scottish crown, Mary was a much-wanted bride, and she had two main candidates most people considered to be serious contenders. One was Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, son of the Earl and Countess of Lennox. Through both of his parents he had claims to the English and Scottish thrones, and so a marriage to him would also strengthen Mary's claim to the English crown. The second candidate was James Hamilton, Earl of Arran, who was a strong contender, but unlike Darnley, was a Protestant. Elizabeth I refused to name a successor to the English crown, and this prompted her to suggest her favourite, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. She didn't particularly want the Catholic Lennox family to get any closer to her throne, not least because Countess Lennox had made her life a misery when her sister Mary was alive. She also promised Mary that marrying Leicester would increase her chances of becoming the English Queen's heir, but the potential bridegroom had little appetite for the idea. Mary had already briefly met her half-cousin Darnley when he had travelled to France to offer condolences on behalf of his family for the death of Francis, but he had also secretly made clear his suit. But for a long time, Mary had not let go of the possibility of marrying Don Carlos, but Philip II was reluctant to agree. Part of this was that Carlos was mentally unstable, sadistic, epileptic, drooled constantly and had a speech impediment, but was set to inherit the throne of Spain and its empire. Due to his father doing a fantastic job of publicly covering all of this up, Mary thought Carlos was a strong, competent young man who would rule steadily by her side. This also brushed Elizabeth up the wrong way, as she didn't trust Mary due to her not ratifying the Treaty of Edinburgh, which recognised Elizabeth's right to rule in England and had been signed by representatives of both France and Scotland. But Mary had been in grieving for her mother at the time, who had died only a month before. However, Elizabeth and Mary also felt an affinity with one another as kinswomen and as fellow female rulers, and both made efforts to remain on friendly terms. However, Mary was increasingly frustrated with Elizabeth's over-interest in who she should marry, although Elizabeth maintained this was due to the fact she would name Mary as her heir if she chose a suitable husband. In February 1565, the Scottish Queen would meet again with Lord Darnley. On paper, he was a good match for her. He was at least 6 feet tall, if not a few inches taller. He was handsome and liked athletic pursuits as much as she did, was accomplished at playing instruments, was a poet, and was considered charming and friendly. However, the part that not many saw was his other side, which was spoilt, petulant, selfish, and immature. His arrogance and quick temper would win him enemies over the course of his short lifetime, as well as his sexual promiscuity, which drew him further and wanted attention. When they met, however, Mary was extremely well taken with him, and when she returned to Edinburgh, he came with her in very high regard. On top of this, having been raised at the English court, he had followed Protestant doctrine despite his family being Catholic, and being fluid in this way regarding religion won over some who were uncertain about him. Until March of that year, Mary had still been prepared to marry the Earl of Leicester, provided Elizabeth publicly acknowledged the Scottish Queen as her heir. However, when this was relayed back to the English monarch, she replied that if Mary married Robert Dudley, she would do everything she could to advance her cousin's position, but that she couldn't commit to naming Mary until she was married herself. Mary must have been furious at being conned in this way. By this point, Mary was also close friends with an Italian called David Rizzio. He was a courtier from Piedmont who had managed to find himself part of the musicians Mary had brought with her from France, and from there became her close confidant and private secretary. He jealously guarded access to the Queen, and was disliked by most of the lords at court for this reason, as well as the fact he was Catholic. Rizzio saw that he would be able to win over some favour if he made friends with Lord Darnley, and encouraged the match with Mary. Darnley had already been knocked back once for proposing too soon, but he fell ill in April, and Mary spent the night by his bedside nursing him back to health. This was scandalous behaviour for an unmarried queen, and it became clear she was infatuated with him shortly after. On the 29th of July 1565, despite the fact they had no dispensation from the Pope, Mary and Henry Stuart were married at Holyrood Palace, although she felt safe knowing that Catherine de' Medici and her son Charles IX apparently approved of the match. Almost immediately, rebellion broke out in response to Darnley becoming king consort. The Protestant nobility were horrified at the marriage, and the Earl of Moray led the charge, taking up arms against his half-sister with many of the other lords. Others were worried the marriage indicated there would be a change in the country's religion to Catholicism, despite Mary publicly having to make an announcement to the contrary. The rebellion came to be known as the Chaseabout Raid, but it was soon put down by the royal forces and Moray was forced to escape to England. It was obvious that the raid had been partly to depose of Mary and was considered treason of the highest order. Part of the boost to Mary's forces was brought by James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, who had returned from exile in France, and he would have a big impact in Mary's life yet to come. During her chase around Scotland without ever actually making contact with Moray's forces, Mary's enemies had of course taken the opportunity to besmirch her name as much as possible. The Earl of Bedford, eager to have Elizabeth's help in aiding Moray, had hinted that Rizzio was having an affair with the Scottish Queen. Whereas Darnley had previously been friends with Rizzio, this slowly began to turn into jealousy, even if the rumours were just that. This wasn't helped by the fact that Mary fell pregnant around this time, although she herself believed she had actually conceived slightly earlier. By the 19th of October, Mary was back in Edinburgh, only now she had lost the wise political advice of Moray. She was instead surrounded with a new series of advisors, namely Bothwell, Athol Lennox, Huntley and her husband Lord Darnley. None of them had the understanding of statecraft that Moray or William Maitland had, but Moray was now in England and Maitland was out of favour. All of this was made worse by the fact that Mary was starting to see the true side of her husband, and it had only been a few months since their marriage. Far from being her biggest supporter, he was a violent drunk who reacted badly if he didn't get his own way, and constantly antagonised the lords whose support she needed. Mary was quickly disillusioned further when he began to frequent the local brothels on his return, and according to at least one Italian source, he also got a lady of the court pregnant late that year. It wasn't long before the short-lived romance between Mary and Henry quickly fizzled out, and they drifted apart, spending most of their time away from each other. Darnley also got ideas above his station and began to believe himself now equal to Mary as a possible future king, not merely a consort. He demanded the crown matrimonial, which under Scots law allowed a consort to rule equally as king alongside his wife the Queen. Already attempting to disassociate him from her everyday dealings in government, Mary understandably refused to give him this, especially as it would have allowed him to rule in his own stead had she died. Their relationship continued to feel strained, and Darnley began to believe rumours that his unborn child was in fact Rizzio's, and that Rizzio was also the reason he had been refused the crown matrimonial. By March 1566, Darnley had convinced himself of this fact, and that his wife and Rizzio were having an affair. He became involved with the Protestant lords who had rebelled previously against Mary, and between them, they secretly conspired to be rid of David Rizzio. To play devil's advocate, Mary had indeed been spending more time with her private secretary, although that was also understandable. She couldn't trust most of the courtiers who should have been her chief advisors, her husband was fast becoming repulsive, and she must have felt incredibly isolated. Fun and faithful Rizzio was one of her closest friends at that time, and it's not surprising she spent more time with him as a result. There were some sources that suggested Darnley had one night in March gone to Mary's door to find it locked, and after forcing his way in, found Rizzio in only a shirt and robe hiding within. However, Darnley never publicly alleged any of this against either his wife or her secretary, which suggests this is much more likely propaganda against the Scottish Queen. On the 9th of March, Mary was in a small closet off her main chamber at Holyrood Palace, measuring about 12 by 10 feet, furnished with a table and a small bed, hosting a supper. The guests included Rizzio, her half-sister Jean, Countess of Argyll, Jean's uncle Robert Beaton, Laird of Craik, Lord Robert Stewart, Sir Arthur Erskine of Blackgrange, as well as the Queen's apothecary, a page and a groom. Rizzio's relaxed attitude in Mary's presence was noted by the fact he didn't remove his cap, a gesture that would otherwise be seen as disrespectful. Darnley, by contrast, was busy allowing his fellow conspirators into the palace, and they were overpowering the guards. At around 6 or 7 o'clock, as everyone was eating, they were surprised by Darnley appearing from behind a tapestry, having entered from a secret set of stairs. He came and sat beside Mary, putting an arm around her, and then Lord Ruthven appeared, dressed in full armour. They demanded David Rizzio be handed over to them, and Mary refused, asking what offence he had caused in astonishment. "Great offence," was the answer, and Ruthven declared Rizzio had caused great dishonour to the Queen's character, and he was the reason for Darnley not gaining the crown matrimonial. Rizzio hid behind Mary in a window recess, his dagger drawn as Ruthven ignored Mary's command for him to leave the room or be arrested for treason. Many of those in the room took it as another great offence that Ruthven refused to go, and weapons were drawn on all sides. 6 other conspirators burst into the room and a violent fight broke out. The table was overturned, and the Countess of Argyll only just managed to save a candle that lit the horrifying scene that ensued. Ruthven grabbed the Queen and pushed her into Darnley's arms, telling her to be unafraid, while Darnley calmly held her tightly against her will. She would later say that one of the intruders had threatened her by pointing their gun at her stomach, and one had threatened her with a knife as they reached across for Rizzio, although Ruthven would later deny this. Mary would later tell her son James that they were saved only by the actions of Anthony Standen, who moved the blade away from the Queen. Mary would understandably always remain convinced she and her unborn son were meant to be the true victims of the conspiracy. Rizzio apparently grabbed at the Queen's skirts, crying out in Italian, "Justice! Justice! Save me, my lady! I am a dying man! Spare my life!" Darnley bent back the man's fingers, and he was grabbed and dragged through to the chamber beyond. He was stabbed at least a horrendous 56 times, and they ensured Darnley's dagger was left in Rizzio's side to proclaim it had been done on the king's orders. However, it's unlikely that Darnley ever actually got a single blow on Rizzio. The private secretary's body was thrown down the main staircase and stripped of its clothing and finery. Mary herself later stated she was in fear of her own life and that of her unborn child, but she was able to speak privately with Darnley after Rizzio was dragged away. She managed to convince him that both of them were in danger, and they escaped the palace at midnight when the guard was relaxed. Darnley realised that he had only been a means to an end, and that the Scottish lords had no intention whatsoever of placing him on the throne. They made it safely to Dunbar Castle, and from there to Edinburgh, where Mary met up with her supporters, although she took up lodgings on the Royal Mile rather than in the castle. It's clear she was unsure who she could trust. On the 21st of March, Mary had her husband declared innocent of Rizzio's murder. She was reconciled with Moray, as well as many of the other lords who had fallen out of favour, and Moray was restored to her council. Mary had also been writing to her cousin Elizabeth, who was shocked and horrified at how Darnley had treated his wife. In April, she wrote a letter asking the English Queen to not allow the fugitive lords to remain in England, and invited Elizabeth to be godmother to her unborn child. Darnley was furious as he hated Elizabeth, and she had never recognised him as King of Scotland, but he was ignored in the interests of his future child, and the possibility of them being heir to England's throne. Elizabeth, for her part, was striding about with a miniature figurine of Mary hanging from a gold chain at her waist, and declared that if Darnley had been her husband, she would have stabbed him. On the 19th of June, Mary finally gave birth between 9 and 11 am after a painful and long labour of around 20 hours. Her child was a boy named James after her father, and she declared that he would be the son who would unite Scotland and England. An English envoy, Sir William Stanley, asked her if she meant for the child to be king before his father, and she replied that Darnley had broken with her. Darnley asked sharply if she had not forgotten and forgiven the events in March. Mary answered that she had forgiven, but could never forget. From that moment on, there was no chance of reconciliation between them. During her lying-in period, Darnley went out drinking heavily and causing chaos in the streets of Edinburgh with his friends, and many began to dislike him once more. Mary herself found him a constant thorn in her side. Others reported that he was no longer in favour with her. She began to fear for her son, as even Catherine de Medici expressed concerns that Darnley was not behaving as he should towards little James. Instead of setting up a separate household for him, as was customary, Mary instead kept her baby son close to her at all times. On top of this, it was reported that Darnley had an intimate friend in Don Francisco de Alava, the Spanish ambassador to the French court, likely because he was trying to cultivate Spanish friendships for his ambitions of gaining the Scottish crown. Mary's terrible judgment of character came to the fore as she increasingly once again found herself unable to know who to trust. She came to lean on the Earl of Bothwell once more, allowing him to manage the bulk of her affairs and conferring gifts on him. She increasingly spent her time away from Darnley, to the point that in July, when she travelled to Stirling alone and Darnley followed her on horseback, she refused him and called him an unwelcome intruder. As with other times when she showed too much favour to one courtier, the rumour mill started about herself and Bothwell. In October 1566, while staying at Jedburgh, Mary was noted as having made a journey on horseback of 4 hours each way to visit Bothwell, where he was ill with wounds after a fight. While no suspicions were raised at the time, and she would have been accompanied at all times by her counsellors and guard, this would later be used as evidence she was having an affair with James Hepburn. After returning to Jedburgh, Mary fell seriously ill, with frequent vomiting of blood, fevers, loss of sight and speech, convulsions, and she passed in and out of consciousness. She had always been ill during her lifetime, and had often had fainting spells while in France. At one point, it grew so severe she was thought to be dying, and even today the exact nature of her illness is unknown. That perennial favourite when talking of British royal families always comes up, porphyria, or it could have been physical and mental exhaustion, hemorrhage from a stomach ulcer, or even a psychosomatic disorder related to the events of the past year. Many also spoke of poison, and while this is normally the laziest response from the past in relation to someone being sick, it really could have been the case this time, especially as it was reported that while vomiting, Mary brought up a strange green lump, very thick and hard. Believing herself she was dying, Mary summoned her council and stated that it was her son, not Darnley, who would succeed her, and that Moray would be regent. However, her French physicians were brought in. By the 24th of October, she started to recover. By early December, Mary was well enough to return to Edinburgh, although her recovery was slow. She met with her advisors at Craigmillar Castle to discuss the Darnley problem, and mainly divorce was discussed in front of the Queen. However, her only course of action down this route was to use consanguinity of being cousins, especially as the dispensation for this had been acquired only after getting married. But this also risked little James's right to the crown, so it's unlikely Mary would have wanted to do this. It's possible the Lords present may have come up with another plan on their own, and at least one source suggests there was a discussion that after James's baptism, Darnley would be thrown in prison. It's also possible that the Lords actually wanted to implicate Mary in a plot against Darnley in some way and overthrow her, then raise her son Protestant, which is what actually happened, so it's not that crazy a theory. Later, a bond would apparently be drawn up at Craigmillar, signed by those involved in Darnley's later murder, although it's not known if Mary knew of this. It was certainly, by this point, in her favour to be rid of her husband, and even if she didn't know the details, she suspected something was being planned, as she warned the Lords not to compromise her honour or conscience. But she also couldn't be bothered warning Darnley. But what is important is that sources on both sides suggest the five main nobles, Moray, Maitland, Huntley, Argyll and Bothwell, came up with the idea of bumping Darnley off while at Craigmillar. But on the 17th of December, Mary had other things to think about, as her son James was baptised. She had spared no expense for this event, using her own money to ensure her courtiers were dressed beyond their usual means, their garments made of cloth of gold, silver and tissue. Lord Darnley, by contrast, had much plainer clothes, and Mary apparently had embroidered some details herself on the garments of the Earl of Bothwell. The festivities at the event were designed to impress the many foreign visitors who had been invited, including a mask, fireworks, and a mock battle on a castle by wild men. Afterwards, Mary went to Drummond Castle, and then to Tullybarden Castle for New Year, but Darnley headed off to his father's estates in Glasgow, fearing for his life. Shortly after arriving, he was struck with an illness, now thought to be either syphilis, smallpox, or again, poison, although the most likely diagnosis was syphilis according to later investigations to his skull and the treatments he was given at the time. This is important, as in the 16th century, the symptoms of syphilis were well known enough for a firm diagnosis of this to be given, and that means Mary would also have likely known the true nature of Darnley's illness, even if it were kept quiet. Whatever the case, he was ill for several weeks, but in January 1567, Mary managed to convince Darnley to return to Edinburgh to recover. There have been suggestions that she did this at the behest of Bothwell, in order to have Darnley assassinated. However, there were several times before this that Mary had flatly refused to consider any plot against her husband. Often, the argument for this hinges on the emotional. That of the very small possibility Mary and Bothwell were having an affair, when in truth, Mary would have been considering the political implications. For both herself and her son, their claims to the English throne were weakened without the presence of Darnley. On the 30th of January, Mary and Darnley arrived in the outskirts of Edinburgh, and they were met by Bothwell, who offered to escort them both to Craigmillar Castle. But still fearing for his life and uncertain who he could trust, Darnley refused, instead stating he wanted to go to a country manor at Kirkerfield. There is proof that hasty arrangements were made for his arrival, so this wasn't planned in any way. There is some confusion over who chose the old Provost's lodging, however, where he ended up staying. Some sources that were predisposed to be against Mary stated that the Queen chose the lodging. Other sources say that Darnley himself chose the old Provost's lodging, or his brother, or in fact the doctors travelling with them. Yet another source suggests Maitland was behind advising the Queen on where the King should stay, knowing that the house was quiet and easy to approach from the back. However, many of these were written after Darnley's murder, and contemporary accounts mostly agree it was Darnley himself who chose where to stay, so this is most likely. Mary and Darnley spent much of their time together, and we know that by the 7th of February, Henry was improving as he was able to write a private letter to his father. The letter stated that he was on the mend, and that this was mostly down to the efforts of his wife. It spoke of her in loving terms, and it makes clear he had obviously decided against his previous plotting. Although there is also the possibility that the letter was invented altogether by the Earl of Lennox, who reported on this, especially as he then described Mary as behaving like Judas. That evening, Darnley promised to tell Mary about some information he had that was important to the safety of both their lives, and also that they had to cultivate a trust between them to guard against those who had advised him to apparently take her life. Rumours were fast spreading of a possible attempt on Darnley's life, some saying Bothwell was going to be behind it. One of William Cecil's spies later stated that Lord Robert Stewart, the Queen's half-brother, had come to warn Darnley that if he wasn't moved from his lodgings, it would cost him his life. On the Saturday the 8th, Mary summoned Robert and asked him about what he had said in front of Darnley, Moray and Bothwell, but he denied ever saying it. A quarrel then apparently occurred between Darnley and Stewart, and swords were drawn, but it ended peacefully. On the Sunday, the 9th of February, it was the last Sunday in Lent, and as such, Mary had a full day of festivities and duties planned. That morning, Moray came to Mary and asked leave to go home to St. Andrews as his wife was very ill after a miscarriage. It now seems very likely he had knowledge of what was about to happen and was purposely removing himself, especially as he didn't come back immediately once his wife was recovered. Late on Sunday morning, Mary attended the wedding of two of her favourite servants at Holyrood Palace and was the guest of honour at the wedding breakfast. She had also promised the couple she would attend a masque they had arranged in the evening to celebrate their marriage. At 4 p.m, she attended a banquet in Canongate, accompanied by Bothwell, Argyle and Huntley, who were already dressed in their costumes for the masque. Around 7 p.m, Mary, who was herself dressed in a masque already, left with many of the lords who had attended her and went to spend the evening with her husband. While Mary chatted and kissed Darnley, those who had come with her, namely Bothwell, Argyle and Huntley, played dice with a member of her Privy Council, who also happened to be a Catholic, Gilbert Kennedy, the Earl of Cassilis. There is again some conflicting reports over when they left, but it was likely between 10 p.m. and midnight, with Mary and her courtiers stating they left around midnight. When Mary left, Darnley made it clear that he expected her to return and spend the night with him. However, Bothwell reminded the Queen that in the morning she had arranged to ride to Seaton, and therefore it would be better for her to sleep at Holyrood Palace. Maitland also agreed with her leaving the lodgings, and this has often puzzled historians who suspect he wanted to do away with the Queen as well. Although, this perhaps shows that if the lords did indeed plan Darnley's murder, they didn't actually want to kill off Mary as well. Moray had only ever shown that he wanted her removed from the throne, not actually executed. Mary attempted to assure Darnley she would be with him the following day, and she gave him a ring as a token of this promise. As Mary mounted her horse in the courtyard, she saw Nicholas Hubert, who was known as Paris, and noted loudly to her surprise that his face was dirty. She would later realise it was possibly gunpowder. He said nothing, and as she rode away, she noted that his face had gone red. Over at Kirkerfield, Darnley got ready for bed and talked to his servants before going to sleep around 1 a.m. An hour later, around 2 a.m, the town was shook by a massive explosion. Some people would later declare they had seen guards running through the darkness just moments before the explosion, and it was followed by the townsfolk waking up suddenly, the air filled with the sound of confusion and fearful cries. The entirety of where Darnley had been staying was blown up from its very foundations, so much so that the neighbouring houses were shaken as well. The Privy Council would later decide it had been blown apart by a large quantity of gunpowder, and that it was so explosive that nothing remained of the rooms within the house except powder. Two women known as Mrs. Merton and Mrs. Mary Sterling both said they saw around 11 men running out of Blackfriars Gate after the explosion, and that Mrs. Merton shouted, they were traitors up to some evil deed, and tried to stop one of them to ask what had happened. The two women were ignored, and they watched the men split into two groups and disappear in different directions. This makes it clear this was an organised explosion, sorted by someone who had men under their command and the resources to make it happen. Mary had been awoken at Holyrood with the explosion, and believing it to be cannon fire, had sent messengers out. When it became clear what had happened, Bothwell was given the news, as he was Sheriff of Edinburgh and therefore in charge of investigating crimes. He immediately sent off his men to find out what had become of the king and went back to bed to await news. Members of the Night Watch came across Captain William Blackadder, one of Bothwell's men, and promptly arrested him as they thought it was rather suspicious he was there. He protested he had been drinking with a friend nearby, but they arrested him anyway. There is no evidence he was part of the conspiracy, so his story might be true. Around the collapsed lodgings of the king, people rescued his servant Thomas Nelson, who had been thrown clear of the blast and was precariously balanced on a wall. They then set to digging through the heaps of ash and stone, hampered by the winter snow and the darkness, knowing that the king was probably in there somewhere. Some of the servants were found in the rubble, but it wasn't until 5 a.m. that anyone thought to look in the south garden of the property, where they found the bodies of Darnley and his valet, Taylor, both wearing short nightshirts and without a single mark on them. Everyone was perplexed as to how the two men had apparently died. Unlike the other poor mutilated bodies of the servants that had been found in the rubble, Darnley and Taylor had no burn marks or marks from being thrown, but also no signs of strangulation, violence or fractures. Near the bodies was a chair, a length of rope, a dagger, Darnley's fur-trimmed nightgown, and a quilt. Unlike the bodies, the quilt and nightgown were covered with powder and had burn marks, and many present at the scene decided the items looked as though they had been placed by hand, rather than blown there, although this could have been hindsight with what came later. Soon after, the Queen was given the news, and she retired to her chamber in deep grief, remaining in there for the remainder of the day. Bothwell was apparently deeply distressed as well, dressing quickly and racing to Mary's side, along with Argyle, Athol, Maitland, and the Countesses of Athol and Mar to comfort her. One of William Cecil's spies arrived at the scene and immediately drew a sketch, which survives to this day. People across Edinburgh were unsettled by Darnley's death, and rumours flew thick and fast. Back at Holyrood, Mary adopted the French custom of mourning, ordering black serge to make a full mourning gown, remaining in seclusion for 40 days within her chambers, with no light allowed to penetrate. It wasn't long after that an autopsy was ordered for Darnley's body, and far from the initial assumption that his body was untouched, he was actually found to have a broken rib and several internal injuries, most likely from being thrown by the blast. The first official report of the event happened quickly after this, as the Privy Council recognised the need to prevent a scandal, and they wrote a letter first to Catherine de Medici. They wrote that they assumed whoever had killed Darnley had also planned to bump off Mary, and that they had already started an inquiry. A further letter sent on the 11th of February, apparently written by Mary but in Scots, a language she did not normally write in, suggesting it was written on her behalf as she dictated, perhaps too distressed to write herself, contained this passage. By whom it has been done, or in what manner, it appears not yet. We doubt not, but, according to the vigilance our council has begun to already use, the certainty of all shall be used shortly, and, the same being discovered, which we know God will never suffer to lie hidden, we hope to punish the same with such rigour as serve for an example of this cruelty to all ages to come. If Mary really had any part in the murder, she was playing the part of a vengeful queen to perfection. It's far more likely this is not a ploy, and that Mary's vehement language is in fact indicative of what she really felt. She went on to also show that she felt the explosion had clearly also been meant to kill her as well as Darnley, and this adds a completely different dimension to events. However, to this day, there is no certainty over who killed Darnley. It was certainly a planned murder, and judging by the many eyewitness reports of armed men wandering around just shortly before and after the explosion, and the motive of removing Darnley in the first place, and possibly Mary herself, this was an attack carried out by someone high in government who had the power and the means to do this without leaving much of a trace. There is a wealth of contemporary evidence from the time, but most of it was collected behind closed doors or after the events, or from unreliable witnesses, making it all very difficult to formulate into a conclusion that doesn't have bias. Many became suspects, including Bothwell, Moray Maitland, the Earl of Morton, and Mary herself. Elizabeth wrote to her cousin remarking that men say that instead of seizing the murderers, you are looking through your fingers while they escape. She suggested Mary was not doing enough to find the murderer or murderers of her husband, while vehemently denying she had any thoughts of Mary being the killer. She was also giving her sound advice, as if Mary wasn't seen to be doing enough to avenge the death of the Scottish king, her own subjects might see fit to depose her. It was Bothwell who emerged as the most likely suspect, however. Due to his closeness to the Queen, he had a strong motive to remove Darnley, especially as the Queen had been rejecting her husband for some time. Bothwell had grown in power over the past few months, had the means to carry the explosion out, and according to some depositions, had carried powder kegs to the lodgings with his men hours before the blast. However, interestingly, Bothwell himself also wrote to Mary and agreed to undergo a trial, which suggests either an innocent man or possibly one who was very certain of having covered his tracks well. Mary also comes under strong suspicion. While much of her actions do point at a woman who was in shock, she also had made no effort to hide that she wanted rid of Darnley. She was close to Bothwell and may well have been having an affair with him, although there is no contemporary evidence of this. She had removed Darnley from his father's stronghold at Glasgow and taken him to Edinburgh, where many of his enemies were, and she herself had allowed the return of many of those men from exile just a few months prior. Certainly, later she had no qualms about telling Anthony Babington she was fine with Queen Elizabeth being assassinated in order to claim the English throne. Why would her estranged husband be a problem? On the other hand, she had also made it clear at all times with her advisors that she did not wish Darnley dead, but that she wanted a legal way to be rid of him. She had also thought he was plotting against her and her son, and so had removed him from Glasgow, from near the Clyde where ships could come in. However, none of the evidence given actually pointed a firm finger at Bothwell, but what he did afterwards says a lot about the possibility of him being the killer. The Earl of Lennox, Darnley's father, accused Bothwell publicly and asked Mary to put him on trial. She agreed, and the Privy Council began proceedings on the 12th of April. Mary had actually met all of Lennox's requests leading up to the trial, and again, it's highly unlikely she would have agreed to such a public ordeal had there been any chance of her being found guilty. However, unfairness soon crept through. On the 10th of April, a few days before, Lennox had apparently tried to enter Edinburgh with 3,000 men, only to be told he could only take 6 with him according to the law. This was true, and the accused could only bring 4. However, Bothwell had apparently turned up with 4,000 men, and instead of reprimanding him, Mary did nothing. There is some evidence to show along with this that Mary might have been quite intimidated by him. As a result, Lennox didn't dare enter Edinburgh in case he was killed, and he fell back to Stirling. He wrote to Mary to ask that the trial be postponed and that he might have sufficient time to find evidence. However, as he had already been pushy in demanding an early trial and was now complaining about it, his request was ignored. Bothwell's trial lasted from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. and he was acquitted. A week later, on the 19th, he held a supper for the Lords from Parliament and made it clear he had plans to marry the Queen. Now, aside from this being a total surprise after the events of the previous week, Bothwell was technically still married to his first wife, Jean Gordon. Her brother was an ally of Bothwell's, and he convinced his sister to start divorce proceedings against her husband around that time. The Lords signed the Ainsley Tavern Bond, in which they agreed to support Bothwell marrying Mary. It's possible he either got them drunk or bribed them or both. He hadn't actually asked Mary at this point, nor was his marriage annulled until the 7th of May. By then, however, Mary was already under his control. She visited her son James for what would be the last time at Stirling Castle between the 21st and the 23rd of April, and rumours afterwards would suggest that she planned to put him into the care of Bothwell. Again, there is no contemporary evidence to support this, and after the precautions she had taken to protect her son so far, and how much she was keen to show her affection for him, it is completely ridiculous that she would have risked him being killed by Bothwell. All sources stating this story came from much later, when Mary's name was fast being ruined by rumours. On her return to Edinburgh on the 24th, she was apprehended on the road by Bothwell and 800 of his men. He told her that certain danger awaited in the city in the form of a riot, and for her own protection, he wished to convey her to his castle at Dunbar for safety. Mary agreed to go with him, but once there, was taken prisoner. At his castle, Mary was then allegedly raped by Bothwell in an effort to secure marriage to her, as now there was a chance she could be pregnant. Whether or not she was a victim of her abduction or a willing participant quickly became a topic of conversation amongst many, not helped by the rumours previously that she had been having an affair with him. Going by the fact she didn't feel she could stand up to him during his trial, and how much power Bothwell had by this point, there is an argument to be made that Mary was intimidated and completely controlled by him. We have no evidence as to what actually happened. For all we know, it's even possible he threatened the life of her son James if she didn't marry him. On top of this, a letter she wrote after these events to the Bishop of Dunblane makes it clear that she felt somewhat broken by what was happening, as she was well aware that holding on to the reins of her country was becoming an impossible task without a man by her side, at least how it would have been viewed by her subjects. She was wearied by all that had happened recently, and Bothwell appeared to be competent, capable of running government, and wasn't a foreign consort, which she knew her subjects would not accept at that time. Mary was also well aware that for the sake of her own honour, as well as that of Bothwell, she could not openly accuse him of rape. Unfortunately, while Mary was left with little choice but to marry him, and she even had good reasons for doing so, many still thought of Bothwell as the most likely murderer of Darnley, and in marrying him, she brought herself under suspicion once more. The marriage would be tempestuous and unhappy, and eventually the Lords would rise up once again against Mary and Bothwell. The marriage angered everyone. Catholics especially wouldn't accept the marriage because they saw Bothwell's annulment as unlawful, and because his marriage to Mary had been under Protestant rites. Bothwell eventually fled to Denmark, where he would go insane and die, and Mary was arrested. She miscarried twins between the 20th and 23rd of July 1567, not only a sad event for her as their mother, but it might also have changed events had they lived. She was forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son, which of course allowed many of her courtiers to once again take power for themselves. Mary would eventually escape to England, throwing herself on the mercy of her cousin Elizabeth and hoping for aid to reclaim her throne, although this aid never materialized. Eventually, Mary would grow weary of being treated as a prisoner for around 19 years, and she would relent to agreeing to a plot to assassinate Elizabeth. Sadly for Mary, the plot was being closely watched, and she was discovered by Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster, and Elizabeth had little choice but to condemn the Scottish Queen to death. Mary would be executed by beheading on the 8th of February 1587 at Fotheringay Castle in the Great Hall, wearing a crimson gown, the colour of martyrdom in Catholicism. All of her belongings and anything that had a drop of her blood on were burned in the Great Fire of the Hall to prevent relics being made of them. Elizabeth would later claim she had not ordered the death of Mary at all, but it was clear she indeed had a hand in events while ensuring she wasn't directly blamed for them. But the death of the Queen of Scots triggered Catholics across Europe to centre in on Elizabeth. Mary's death was not a direct trigger for Spain choosing to attack England, but it was one of the main reasons. Much of Mary's part in events leading up to Darnley's death and shortly afterwards were out of her hands. She was a strong queen, much like Elizabeth, but unlike her cousin, she was not a good judge of character. Mary put her faith in the wrong men, surrounded herself with advisors who wanted power for themselves at the expense of her own, and ultimately was a lonely figure who became a tragic one in lieu of her decisions. She was clever and well educated in statecraft, but she leaned too much on her counsel and showed favouritism to a degree that made others jealous. These factors would all play into Mary's place in people's minds after Darnley's death. It seems highly unlikely she actually had a part in his murder. At every point, she seems to have dissuaded those around her from harming him physically, instead wishing to have him removed in a way that did not affect her conscience or honour. She allowed a trial and wrote letters that absolutely suggest her innocence, because the exposure through these would have turned up something if Mary had been involved. She was hampered in pursuing the murderers by a Privy Council who knew it was in their favour if Mary was seen to be incompetent at the reins of government. In essence, it's highly unlikely Mary had a hand in the murder of Lord Darnley, or even had knowledge of it. We can never be completely certain, as the evidence for the crime is so muddied by speculation, rumour and bias that it is an impossible task beyond conjecture. But it's far more likely Mary was a tragic queen who never really had the opportunity to stamp her own authority on her kingdom due to those around her having an invested interest in her failure. Mary Tudor, otherwise known as Mary I, was the first female monarch in England to rule in her own right, and at the start of her reign, she was a popular and much loved member of the royal family. Everything seemed set to go well to usher in a new age. So what changed? Why did she come to be known as Bloody Mary? And did she even deserve the name? Mary was born in Greenwich at the Palace of Placentia on the 18th of February 1516. She was not the first child her mother, Catherine of Aragon, had given birth to, but she would be the first to survive beyond infancy. Her father, Henry VIII, had been hoping for a boy, but a healthy royal child was still a blessing. For 7 long years, her mother had endured 4 miscarriages, a stillbirth, and a baby son who had died at 2 months old. She must have felt the pressure of both Henry VIII's expectations and the country's. Mary was baptised into the Catholic faith that would come to dominate so much about her and her later reign, just 3 days after she was born. Any disappointment Henry felt at his child being a girl was smoothed over by his belief that he would yet be able to have a son. While we cannot know what Catherine really felt, the fact that her 7th child was also the first to survive probably meant she didn't feel as confident as Henry about the chances of having a son to follow Mary. In other words, Catherine always saw Mary as the heir to England's throne. However, although Mary was always a much-loved child, she was, as was the case with most royal children, not brought up alongside her parents. Her household would have been her close family, and foremost of these was the Countess of Salisbury, Margaret Pole, who in May 1520 took on the role of Lady Governess. She would become the greatest influence on Mary in her formative years. Margaret was not only a close friend of Catherine of Aragon, but she knew court etiquette back to front, and her character was impeccable. In short, she was a perfect example to bring up an English princess. Mary was, like her younger sister Elizabeth, a gifted child. Despite the myth that she lived a dour and fervently religious upbringing as a child, she actually enjoyed the frivolity of plays and masques, and a significant portion of her household budget was spent on these for the Christmas festivities. She also loved music, and at just 4 years old, she wowed a group of visiting French gentlemen sent by Francis I to report back on the then future bride of his son with a recital on the virginals, a version of a harpsichord. As her childhood years went by, Mary would learn to read and write Latin, as well as studying French and her mother's native tongue, Spanish. And although her father Henry was impressed with his daughter's skill and taste, it was as an eligible bride he took the most interest. Royal princesses were political tools, and Henry ensured he took full advantage at the earliest possible moment. At 2½, Mary was betrothed to the Dauphin of France, although she was not expected to be in France until she was around 14. It's also unlikely Henry ever really imagined his daughter marrying Francis I's son, also named Francis, but it served the interests of England to attempt to bring peace, however temporary, through a contract of marriage. After just 3 years, the contract would be called off, and Mary would instead be promised to Charles V of Spain, her cousin who was 22 years her senior. But it was a happy occasion, and he was greeted warmly by Londoners when he visited for the only time to meet his young bride-to-be. It was also the only time Mary met her cousin Charles, but she always remembered him fondly as a kind father figure. But, as with the Dauphin, this marriage was called off after a few years, but this time with the mutual arrangement of Charles V. This was a pattern that would dominate Mary's life through her childhood, teen years and adulthood. While it was normal for a royal daughter to be used in this way as a political pawn, Mary had so many suitors it cannot have been possible for her to have remembered half of them. Each time she was recalled to court by her father, it was likely she would be introduced to the next possible husband she would never marry. But it was also around this time that Henry seems to have accepted, as Catherine had so much earlier, that Mary was likely to be his only heir. In the contract negotiations for the marriage between his young daughter and Charles V, his nephew-in-law, Henry remarks that the fact she was his sole heir meant he expected a large sum from the Holy Roman Emperor in exchange for her hand. In 1525, when Mary was 9 years old, she was sent to reside in the Welsh Marches, but this was not a full transfer of power as it might be for a Prince of Wales. She was given her own council at Ludlow Castle. The reason given for her presence was that in the absence of any Prince of Wales living there or in the Marches, the administration of justice had suffered. but her position was nebulous, and although she was addressed by her courtiers as the Princess of Wales, she was never formally invested as such. As Mary grew into a young woman, reports of her were often complimentary, described as having a charming personality, more outgoing than her mother, but less boisterous than her father, and was well liked at her appearances at court. Her servants loved her dearly, and she would often look after them with lifelong support. She also loved her parents, once writing to Cardinal Wolsey in 1528 to thank him in aiding her to see them for a month and being in their company. In short, Mary was seen as a charming young woman who was well loved by those who knew her. But as Mary progressed into her elder teens, it was not the issue of her marriage that took centre stage, but that of her parents. Mary had been shielded for a long time from the difficulties of her parents' strained marriage, and so was unprepared at the age of 15 when she had to accept the reality of what was about to happen. Everything had really started in 1522, when Anne Boleyn entered the English court, fresh from France. She was very different to the other ladies of the court, and after a few years, she would finally catch the eye of Henry. Some hated Anne, seeing her as nothing more than a royal concubine who had separated a father and a daughter, broken up a marriage, and most unforgivably, severed England from Rome's influence. Others saw in Anne Boleyn a well-educated woman who cared deeply about religion and the poor. Mary would become her mortal enemy. But this was not merely a personal hatred for breaking up her parents' marriage, it ran far deeper than that. Through the influence of Anne at Henry's side, Mary saw even less of her father than before, was separated from her mother even when she was ill, and lost her title of princess, being demoted to Lady Mary. Her physical and emotional well-being was shattered by the event of her parents' divorce, and she would only ever speak of Anne as that woman. It's not hard to imagine the experience would harden her against several things: the Protestant religion, the Boleyn family, and the idea that her parents' marriage was invalid. But the truth was that Henry had planned to divorce himself from Catherine of Aragon long before he cast his gaze over Anne Boleyn. If it hadn't been her, it would have been someone else. In her mind, watching her mother continue on as normal at public functions with her father, Mary came to the conclusion, as Catherine did, that conscience was the main reason behind Henry's decision to separate. He based the need to divorce Catherine on the basis that she had been his brother's wife, although she always maintained she had never consummated the marriage with Prince Arthur. Therefore, Mary learned an important lesson, that a clear conscience was the most important thing for yourself and your relationship with God. It was something that would cause her many problems in the future. To make things worse, although Mary had grown up in the luxurious trappings expected of a princess, she was now to have it all removed. Her household was dissolved, and her servants were dismissed, including the Countess of Salisbury, Margaret Pole, the most steadfast influence in her life since birth. Mary was moved to her half-sister's new household at Hatfield House. It must have felt as though the world had turned upside down. Although Mary found common ground with her half-sister while younger, she refused to acknowledge her as a princess, or her mother as a queen. It no doubt influenced how she treated Elizabeth in later years. Her father was angered by her refusal, and their relationship became strained over the next 4 years. But 1536, when Mary was 20 years old, was to be a dramatic year. On the 7th of January, her mother Catherine died. Her health had faltered for some time, and the cause of her death was thought to be that of a heart condition. One of Catherine's final acts was to write a letter to her husband Henry, beseeching him to think of his immortal soul before worldly cares, and above all, to be a good father to their daughter Mary. It was a touching and heartfelt letter, but Henry would take little heed of it. Mary, for her part, was devastated. She wasn't permitted to be with her mother when she was dying, and so she was never given a chance to say goodbye to her. No doubt this would have left its mark on her once joyful personality. Mary had gone from being a loved and doted on princess to becoming a cast-aside illegitimate daughter of the king, and now she had lost her mother without having the chance to see her again. Just a few months later, finally having tired of waiting for a son and arguing with Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell came up with one of the most infamous plots in Tudor history, discrediting his wife with accusations of adultery, incest, and even of having tried to poison Catherine of Aragon and Mary. Henry had Anne shut up in the Tower of London. There she fell into a hysterical state, rambling for hours and giving Cromwell all the supposed evidence he required to cement the sentence for what was, most likely, an innocent woman in regards to the charges against her. On the 19th of May that year, she was sent to the scaffold and beheaded. There is little evidence of Mary's immediate reaction to the news, but it must have felt something of a triumph that woman was gone, and no doubt the princess assumed she would automatically be restored to her former place. She waited a week with no news, writing to Cromwell and asking him to be a conduit between herself and Henry, no doubt confused as she allowed her naivety to allow her to believe the best of her father. Henry was unyielding in his desire for Mary to bend to his will and accept him as head of the church. She agreed to submit to his authority as far as God and her conscience would allow her to. It wasn't enough, and on the 22nd of June, 1536, she was forced to sign a document that not only accepted her father's authority as her sovereign and head of the church, but also stated that her parents' marriage was unlawful and incestuous. It must have been a traumatic decision to make. Mary knew there was no chance of reconciliation to her previous position without signing it, and there were few people fighting in her corner now. But it taught Mary a valuable lesson that she would later put into play during her own time as a ruler. You could force people to bend to your will if you were in charge, if you thought it was in their best interests, and that people did not always know what was best for them. Only the monarch could know that. It also probably hardened her further against the Church of England. It left its shadow on her conscience for the rest of her life. Everything she had stood for had been relinquished in her very human desire for acceptance by her father and a peaceful life. Mary was welcomed back to court, but it wasn't quite as it had been before. Like Elizabeth, Mary was still considered illegitimate, although they were later restored to the line of succession in 1544. A few proposals came forward for Mary's hand, but they came to nothing. In 1541, Mary suffered yet more loss when her father had Margaret Pole beheaded for her supposed part in a Catholic plot in which her son, Reginald Pole, was implicated. To make the loss more horrific, Margaret's execution was the stuff of nightmares, as the young and inexperienced executioner missed her neck, hacking her head and shoulders to pieces. By this point, Mary must have felt numb from grief. Margaret Pole herself had been nothing but loyal and had been a secondary mother for Mary. She deserved better than the terrible death she received. Not surprisingly, the young princess fell ill once again. Henry VIII died in 1547. Whatever Mary did publicly, she must have privately felt relief. Despite being her father, Henry had not acted like one for much of her life, and finally, he could have no control over it. She was left a wealthy and independent woman with her own estates. But the role she had been prepared for as a little girl, that of England's monarch, was passed over to her brother Edward. While she lived in an era where women were a subspecies to men, and no one had ever really bothered to define what the role of a female regnant would be, Mary must have still mulled over the question in her mind of how she would have ruled. As it was, Edward and Mary frequently butted heads over her choice of religion. King Edward VI, as he was now known, had only ever known life with the Protestant religion his father had created. Mary, by contrast, refused to relinquish her Catholic faith and continued to unlawfully hold Mass in her own home. When Edward angrily responded to this by demanding she stop, Mary wrote to her cousin Charles V to apply international pressure to allow her to continue. For much of her brother's reign, Mary stayed away from court, living on her own estates. On one of the few occasions where she went to court at Christmas 1550, Mary was reduced to tears and embarrassed before the courtiers when Edward used the occasion to admonish her for not capitulating to his demands, but still she refused to do as he commanded. On the 6th of July 1553, after an illness that may have been tuberculosis, Edward VI died at the age of just 15. Mary must have been waiting for her moment, but sadly, it didn't come. Aware that Mary would attempt to reverse the religious reforms put in place by his father and himself, Edward excluded her from succession to the throne, instead naming Lady Jane Grey and her sisters as his successors. But the princess was sharper than her brother had expected, and although she had been asked to come to London to visit Edward before he died, Mary caught wind of rumours that it was a trap, and instead fled to her estates in East Anglia. Here, she didn't just have wealth, but men ready to fight for her. Many Catholic subjects still lived in the areas that were Mary's strongholds, and she was still a popular and well-liked princess. On the 12th of July, just 2 days after Jane had been proclaimed Queen by the Duke of Northumberland, Mary assembled her forces at Framlingham Castle, where she had made her base. Support for Northumberland and Jane's reign crumbled away, and the Privy Council declared in Mary's favour on the 19th of July, deposing Jane. It was a triumph for Mary, and one she had done in her own right, using nothing but her popularity amongst the people and her sense of regal authority. She knew something important that her sister Elizabeth also understood later, that no monarch could hold the throne of England without the common consent of its people. On the 3rd of August, Mary rode triumphantly into London with her half-sister Elizabeth by her side. It was a calculated show of a united front. The correct line to the throne had been restored, and now all would be well. But it was something of a sham. Elizabeth and Mary were not close, and Mary was suspicious of her sister due to her Protestant leanings. But once Mary was crowned as Queen on the 1st of October, she lost no time in starting her new regime in the manner everyone had expected. She released 2 important men from the Tower of London that would aid her rule: Thomas Howard, who would serve in her Privy Council, and Stephen Gardiner, who would become her Lord Chancellor. Both were deeply Catholic. It was obvious from the start Mary was going to attempt to restore the Catholic faith to England.
While she has often been seen as a fanatic, it must be understood that she saw herself as saving the souls of her kingdom. She wasn't alone in her thinking. However, Mary initially issued a proclamation that she would not force her subjects to follow Catholicism. After all, many of them had been born into Protestantism as her brother had, and it was all they had ever known. She understood that making someone agree to something on paper did not mean they would follow it in their heart. She had first-hand understanding of this, with the document she had been forced to sign stating her father was head of the church. At the same time, by September of that year, many leading Protestant church leaders had been put into the Tower of London. Laws were passed declaring her parents' marriage valid and repealing all of the religious laws Edward had passed. Church doctrine was returned to the form it had held before the break with Rome, and Parliament would later be convinced to repeal Henry VIII's religious laws as well. It was clear Mary felt she was restoring the country to the right path and was given the epithet Defender of the Faith. But Mary won over her subjects by immediately also implementing various measures to save the economy. Coinage under her father and brother had become much adulterated, and the issue of new gold and silver coins bearing her images had an immediate effect of lowering the cost of goods by a third. Mary also used her own significant wealth to repay the debts of both her father and brother, which increased goodwill towards her. In short, the public, who had not known what to expect from their much-loved princess, now looked forward to a prosperous and stable government under their new queen. But Mary also had her forgiving side. She understood that the main instigator of the plot to place Jane Grey on the throne was not Jane herself, but the Duke of Northumberland, and he was summarily executed. But Jane she attempted to save, sending priests to talk Jane into converting to Catholicism and accepting Mary as her queen. But Jane clung as stubbornly to her faith as Mary did to her own, refusing to recant her Protestantism. Even when Mary's advisors told Mary she needed to commit to getting rid of Jane, the new queen refused to accept the idea. Frances Brandon, Jane's mother, had been a close cousin and friend of hers when they were teenagers, and she had already forgiven Jane's father on the basis of this kinship. But unfortunately, when word of her possible marriage to the Catholic Philip of Spain reached the nobles, a number of them rose up in what came to be known as Wyatt's Rebellion. After the rebellion was put down, Mary was left with little choice but to rid herself of Jane, as Jane's father, Henry Grey, had been involved. She only gave in and agreed to Jane's execution, as well as that of her young husband Guilford Dudley, after exhausting all possible avenues, and Mary only did so reluctantly under pressure from her advisors. No doubt it weighed heavily on her mind, as she later did what she could to return the fortunes of Frances, her cousin, and her two remaining daughters. Mary's other immediate concern was that of producing an heir. She was by now 37 years old, and the idea of not marrying would simply not have crossed Mary's mind. Her grandmother, Isabella of Castile, had never questioned her own ability to rule as a queen, but she would never have considered doing it alone. The religion Isabella deeply impressed on her family enforced that it was even a regal woman's duty to marry and bear children, and this was passed down to her daughter Catherine, who in turn passed it on to Mary. She reinforced this idea by her devotion to Henry VIII, always maintaining she was his wife even after their divorce. So when Mary's chance came, especially after so many years waiting, she would have seen marriage as much her duty as ruling her country. Her cousin Charles V suggested his only legitimate son, Philip of Spain, as her husband. Marriage negotiations began, and Philip's portrait was sent to Mary, who apparently fell in love with him at first sight upon viewing it. However, the marriage proposal was not popular with many members of her council, who unsuccessfully tried to convince Mary to marry an Englishman. Mary was the first undisputed queen regnant in English history after the disputed and short reigns of Empress Matilda and Jane Grey, and there was no precedent to how to handle her marriage. When most queens married, their lands and possessions became their husbands. It was feared that England would become just another part of the Habsburg Empire. To counter this, in the aftermath of Wyatt's rebellion, Mary had a contract drawn up that stated that although Philip would be called King of England, military support could not be given to his father, Philip could not act without his wife's consent, and a parliament could only be called by both of them, but only during Mary's lifetime. It also stated that they would have control over their own respective realms, as her maternal grandparents had done. Philip was apparently unhappy with these terms, but the marriage would bring political and strategic gains to Spain, as well as preserving the Catholic faith on both sides of the English Channel. He didn't find Mary attractive, but the marriage went ahead on the 25th of July 1554 at Winchester Cathedral, just 2 days after they first met. In September, Mary thought that finally she had secured the throne for her bloodline, as her body began to show signs of being pregnant. She stopped menstruating and began to feel nausea in the mornings. Her physicians thought she was pregnant too. In April 1555, Elizabeth was released from her house arrest at Woodstock to witness the birth of her new niece or nephew. She had been placed at Woodstock as Protestant plots to remove Mary and place Elizabeth on the throne were revealed, although Elizabeth's part in them had not been confirmed. Mary had become more suspicious of her sister over the years, and this was mostly down to religion. Mary herself had defied her brother's commands to conform to his religious laws, and so she knew it was possible for Elizabeth to secretly be planning to reverse everything again. However, 2 more months passed, and no child appeared. Mary's abdomen receded, and it seems likely the whole event had been a false pregnancy. This was most likely brought on by Mary's desire to have a child and secure her own bloodline for the throne. The stress of finding out she was exactly where she had been before, her embarrassment at not being pregnant, and her heartbreak at not being a mother must have taken its toll. To make matters worse, Philip had to leave shortly afterwards to command his armies in the Low Countries, also embarrassed by the whole event. Mary held her composure as they said goodbye, but broke down in tears privately shortly after his departure. It was the sign of a woman broken down by the weight put upon her shoulders. In December 1554, Mary wrote a brief statement to her council, summing up her feelings on the religion of the realm. Within it, she stated how she wanted to see that all universities and churches were following the rules of Catholicism, and that those who were heretics should be punished. She also stated, "I would wish none to be burnt without some of the council's presence and, both there and everywhere, good sermons at the same." It is for this punishment Mary became infamous, for burning around 300 Protestants. But what is often forgotten for context is that in Mary's time, few would have raised their brows at the idea of heretics being burned at the stake, either Protestant or Catholic. It had been an established punishment for heresy for centuries. However, while many of Mary's qualities can be redemptive, this was state-prescribed murder. But this was no different to the rest of her family. Her father was responsible for as many as up to 72,000 executions during his reign. Elizabeth, in her later reign, would execute around 450 people in an uprising against her in the north, and she put 130 priests to death simply for being Catholic. In other words, while Mary's choice of punishing heretics in this way was horrific, it was no different to other rulers before or after her. Her own brother's short reign had also featured burning of Catholic leaders. Burning at the stake was a popular choice for heresy, as it was believed it gave heretics a taste of the hellfire if they didn't recant. What differed was the need in Elizabeth's reign to discredit Mary and the Catholic religion, and promote the virtues of Elizabeth tolerating both Catholicism and Protestantism. The numbers were played up or down as needed. However, even if Mary's decision is taken in the context of her time, at least one punishment was especially cruel, that of Thomas Cranmer. He was forced to watch Bishops Ridley and Latimer burning at the stake from his view in a tower near the Bocardo prison in Oxford, where he was imprisoned. The sight was enough to make him recant the Protestant faith and reconcile with Catholicism. Normally, this was enough for the monarch to forgive and release, but in Cranmer's case, this didn't happen. He had been imprisoned for 2 years, and in that time there had been several switches back and forth between the two religions, and it was obvious he would likely escape to Protestant-controlled Europe if he were freed, possibly to work against Mary. She was determined to make an example of him, and pressed ahead with his execution anyway. On the 21st of March 1556, Thomas Cranmer spoke to the crowd before he was to be burned, but unexpectedly went off script, once again renouncing Catholicism and becoming a martyr to the Protestant cause. Cases like this would harden Protestants further against Mary. While she may have believed it was necessary to kill a few people in order to save the souls of many, it was undoubtedly a cruel move to refuse to pardon where she could. It seemed her few years of queenship had changed Mary from someone who was willing to try and save even someone who had usurped her throne, to one who did whatever she had to in order to keep her throne. The burnings were hugely unpopular and gave way not just to anti-Catholic feeling, but anti-Spanish feeling in turn. The victims were held up as martyrs, and Mary was warned that if she continued with the policy, it could cause a revolt. So why did she continue? It can't have simply been the thought of saving the souls of her kingdom. Although Mary had once been a tolerant and gentle person, keeping her throne was now her priority. With no heir, Mary would have quickly realised what was going to happen. Elizabeth was still her heir in the case of her death, and it was obvious that the princess preferred the Protestant faith. Philip finally returned to visit his wife in March 1557 to persuade Mary to aid him in a war against France. Nothing came of this until June, however, when Reginald Pole's nephew, Thomas Stafford, invaded England as part of a plot to depose Mary. It was unsuccessful, but war was declared, and England's husbands and sons went to fight in a Spanish war. It was a hugely unpopular move and did nothing to help Mary's image. This wasn't helped by a series of wet harvests that occurred during her 5-year reign, which led to famine. And although Mary was married to the ruler of Spain, Spanish merchants jealously guarded their trade routes and refused to share them. And Mary could not, as Elizabeth later did, advocate piracy against Spanish ships, as she was married to Philip II. But another event happened with Philip's visit. Mary once again was convinced she was pregnant. The due date for the baby, March 1558, came and went, and no child was born. But this time, there was no embarrassment as there had been the first time. In fact, there was hardly any flicker of notice given at all. Mary was forced to accept that Elizabeth would succeed her throne. From the end of that summer, Mary fell ill. She took to her apartments and was stricken with fevers and weakness. At the end of October, she added to her will that she understood her sister would be queen. She had attempted to evade Elizabeth's grasp on the throne, but Mary knew she was dying, and it was more important for England to have a stable and rightful ruler. On the 17th of November, possibly from uterine cancer, ovarian cysts, or influenza, Mary I, England's first undisputed female ruler, died. She left a tangled legacy. In her youth, she had been a precocious and lovable child who had delighted everyone who met her, impressing them with her gentle and joyful nature. But her father's decision to divorce her mother and cast Mary aside had killed some of that in her, and Mary was hardened against aspects of the kingdom she later came to rule. Her devotedness to Catholicism and her certainty that it was the right path for England would lead her to burn over 300 people for heresy, and her forgiving nature was pushed to the limit by her desire to prevent her Protestant sister from claiming her throne. But she was really no better or worse than her siblings or father. She is often compared to Elizabeth's long and fruitful reign, but in reality it is unfair to do so, as Mary's reign was much shorter and plagued by events out of her control, such as the overly wet harvests. Her punishments for heretics were horrific, but not out of context for the time she lived in, and the numbers killed were little different to those of her siblings, and far less than her father. Mary I made mistakes, but as the first Queen Regnant of England, perhaps she could be forgiven for trying to figure out her role. Elizabeth did a much better job of negotiating balance with her council and advisors, but she had the advantage of having watched Mary's mistakes and gains and learning from them. So while Mary is known to history as bloody, thanks mostly to the effective propaganda from Protestants in Elizabeth's time, she was much more complex than that in reality. She was a much-loved princess who became hardened due to her youth, and then went on to become a determined queen who wanted to do the best by her country and God. She should instead perhaps be remembered as a woman scared for her position, steadfast in her beliefs, and desperate only to set her life back to a time when it felt better. In the end, Elizabeth and Mary, along with their brother Edward and the 6 wives of Henry VIII, were victims of their father's determination to have a son, a mindless policy that set in motion decades of religious dissent, misery, and persecution.
Elizabeth I emerged from a childhood marked by trauma and mortal danger to become one of England's most skilled political operators. Born to a mother executed for treason, declared illegitimate at age 2, imprisoned in the Tower at 20, and suspected of treason throughout her half-sister's reign, Elizabeth developed survival skills that would define her governance. Her political acumen was genuine, but so were the bodies. Over 600 rebels executed after the Northern Rebellion, and almost 200 Catholics martyred during her reign. This is not the story of Gloriana the myth, but of a ruthless pragmatist who transformed apparent weaknesses into sources of power, of the real, complicated, very human Elizabeth. Elizabeth Tudor was born September 7th, 1533 at Greenwich Palace, a profound disappointment to parents expecting a male heir. When Anne Boleyn was executed May 19, 1536, 2-year-old Elizabeth lost not just her mother, but her legitimacy. Henry VIII's marriage was annulled, making Elizabeth officially a bastard. Her household descended into chaos. Staff didn't even know whether to address her as Princess or simply Lady Elizabeth. Elizabeth's education was extraordinary. By age 16, she was fluent in 6 languages: Latin, Greek, French, Italian, Spanish, and Flemish. Her tutor Roger Ascham marvelled, "Her mind has no womanly weakness, her perseverance is equal to that of a man." This intellectual training, combined with observation of 6 stepmothers, including 3 executed or divorced, taught Elizabeth that knowledge was power and that women in Tudor politics existed in constant danger. The most formative trauma came in 1547 to 1548 when Thomas Seymour, her stepmother Catherine Parr's new husband, began visiting 14-year-old Elizabeth's bedroom early mornings in his nightgown. His attentions were absolutely not wanted. On a letter from Catherine to Thomas, Elizabeth scratched in Latin, "Nolito me tangere," "Let him not touch me." When pregnant Catherine caught Seymour with Elizabeth alone, she sent the girl away. After Catherine's death in childbirth, Seymour's attentions returned until his arrest and execution for treason in March 1549. During interrogations about Seymour's plot, 15-year-old Elizabeth demonstrated extraordinary behaviour for her age under humiliating questioning. When told of Seymour's execution, she betrayed no emotion. Elizabeth learned a sustained lesson in survival through self-discipline and the manipulation of appearances. Mary I's reign transformed survival skills into art form. During Wyatt's rebellion in early 1554, Elizabeth was implicated despite Wyatt's scaffold confession exonerating her. On March 18, 1554, Palm Sunday, 20-year-old Elizabeth entered the Tower of London through Traitor's Gate, the same apartments where Anne Boleyn had been imprisoned. While she remained stoic in the face of her imprisonment, it must have been terrifying to follow in her mother's footsteps. For 2 months, she faced interrogation. Released on the 18th anniversary of her mother's execution, she was confined at Woodstock Palace, where she reportedly scratched on a window, "Much suspected by me, nothing proved can be," quoth Elizabeth the prisoner. By October 1555, after Mary's phantom pregnancy, Elizabeth returned to Hatfield. She had survived 18 months of imprisonment without ever saying anything that might be misconstrued as implicating herself, a masterclass in saying nothing. When Mary died November 17, 1558, Elizabeth inherited a kingdom £300,000 in debt, roughly around £150 million today, having just lost Calais, religiously divided with her own legitimacy questioned by Catholics. At 25, she had lived through her mother's brutal death, her father's rejection and reconnection, several stepmothers, 3 monarchs, 2 imprisonments, possible sexual assault, and countless brushes with execution. These experiences shaped everything that followed. Elizabeth's first parliament faced a deceptively simple question. What kind of church would England have? The Elizabethan religious settlement has been mythologized as a moderate via media between Catholicism and Protestantism. The reality was messier, a Protestant settlement in doctrine that retained Catholic structure, imposed through political maneuvering and enforced with escalating violence. The Act of Supremacy in April 1559 established Elizabeth as Supreme Governor, not Supreme Head, cleverly avoiding theological claims of spiritual headship. The Act of Uniformity passed the House of Lords by only 3 votes, achieved through imprisoning 2 Catholic bishops. The 1559 Book of Common Prayer combined elements, allowing latitude for different beliefs about Christ's presence in the Eucharist. Archbishop Matthew Parker, chosen partly for loyalty to Anne Boleyn's memory, oversaw the implementation. The 39 Articles of Religion in 1571 established doctrinal boundaries, only 2 sacraments recognised, transubstantiation rejected, papal jurisdiction denied, clerical marriage permitted. Approximately 800 clergy resigned or were deprived by the mid-1560s for refusing conformity. About 300 Catholics fled abroad, and the English College at Douai was founded in 1568 to train seminary priests. But most parish priests kept their posts, and half of all parishes retained Catholic vestments for at least a decade. From the Protestant side came the vestments controversy, when Puritan clergy refused required dress, and the admonition controversy condemning popish abuses. There continued to be tension on both sides. Elizabeth famously declared, "I have no desire to make windows into men's souls. There is only one Christ, Jesus, one faith. All else is a dispute over trifles." But this ambiguity masked systematic enforcement. The 1559 recusancy fine of 12 pence for missing church seems modest, except it was 1 day's labour for a skilled worker, and enforcement intensified dramatically after 1570. The settlement was less theological compromise than Protestant imposition, with enough ambiguity to allow church papists to survive without openly challenging royal authority. The settlement's true nature emerged in its consequences. A Protestant church that would endure, purchased at the cost of almost 200 Catholics executed during Elizabeth's reign, and systematic persecution that drove Catholicism from a majority religion to a faith of small sect confined largely to gentry households. But religion aside, Elizabeth's foreign policy genius lay in using the possibility of her own marriage as diplomatic leverage, while never surrendering independence through actual commitment. Her council debated which alliance would benefit England. Elizabeth ensured no alliance would constrain England's monarch. The Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis in April 1559 ended war with France but confirmed Calais remained French, effectively forever. Scotland emerged as an immediate crisis. Mary, Queen of Scots, used English royal arms, a direct challenge to Elizabeth's legitimacy. The Treaty of Edinburgh in 1560 expelled French forces and required Mary to relinquish claims to England's throne. Mary never ratified it, but the treaty achieved its effect: French withdrawal and Protestant triumph in Scotland. Elizabeth's 1562 intervention in France proved less successful. The Treaty of Hampton Court loaned Huguenots 140,000 crowns and sent 3,000 English troops to occupy Le Havre, officially to protect the port, but actually as security for Calais. When French Catholics and Huguenots made peace, Elizabeth refused to withdraw. The port fell to a united French force in July 1563. The Treaty of Troyes a year later paid England 20,000 crowns less than the original loan. Elizabeth felt betrayed by the Huguenots and would never trust them again. Relations with Spain oscillated between alliance and crisis. The Spanish bullion crisis in late 1568 marked the turning point. When Spanish ships carrying £85,000 in gold sought shelter in English ports, Elizabeth learned the gold was actually a loan from Italian bankers to Spain. She seized it and treated it as a loan to England instead. Philip II, outraged, imposed a 5-year trade embargo. England retaliated by seizing Spanish ships. The crisis pushed England to develop trade routes with the Baltic and Russia, reducing reliance on Antwerp. The marriage question threaded through all foreign policy. Philip II, Robert Dudley, Archduke Charles of Austria, and French dukes all featured as suitors. Elizabeth told Parliament in 1563, "If I follow the inclination of my nature, it is this: beggar woman and single, far rather than queen and married." By keeping multiple negotiations ongoing, she played countries off against each other, maintaining leverage without surrendering authority to a husband or tying England to a single alliance. When smallpox nearly killed her in 1562, Elizabeth asked the Privy Council to make Robert Dudley protector, not a husband, but a trusted advisor who would serve her vision. Elizabeth established a streamlined Privy Council of 18 to 20 members, compared to Mary I's 50+, believing a multitude doth make rather discord and confusion than good counsel. At its centre stood William Cecil, who served 40 years. first as Secretary of State, then Lord Treasurer. His influence was comprehensive. He controlled finances, dominated policymaking, created an intelligence service under Francis Walsingham, and engineered Mary Queen of Scots' destruction. Elizabeth's political skills were formidable. Highly educated and fluent in multiple languages, she could reprimand foreign ambassadors in fluent Latin. She transformed the language of politics into the language of love, presenting herself as spouse or mother of her kingdom. But her famous answerless to Parliament exemplified strategic prevarication. She neither agreed nor refused, wrong-footing pressure from councillors. Parliament met infrequently, only 10 to 13 parliaments during her 45-year reign, averaging 10 weeks per session. Sessions were called primarily for taxation. 11 of them involved money requests. The Parliament of 1572-81 saw an unprecedented 54 prorogations, reflecting diplomatic manoeuvring around marriage negotiations. Conflicts centred on marriage, succession, and religion. In 1559, the Commons raised the marriage question. Elizabeth's response was biting. "I am already bound unto a husband, which is the Kingdom of England." By November 1566, facing a delegation of 60 lords and commons, her response was unusually haughty. A strange thing that the foot should direct the head in so weighty a cause. She compared Parliament to bridleless colts and declared, "My lords, do whatever you wish. As for me, I shall do no otherwise than pleases me." She refused to name a successor, knowing from experience that being a second person meant standing in danger of her life. What appeared as parliamentary opposition was actually privy councillors using Parliament to pressure Elizabeth on policies they favoured. But Parliament was characterised more by cooperation than conflict, with only a few MPs speaking in debates. Elizabeth controlled her own policy more than any other Tudor, keeping a tight leash on both her Privy Council and her country. But problems were not restricted to the palace chambers. The Northern Rebellion of November to December 1569 represented the greatest domestic challenge to Elizabeth's rule. Northern England remained strongly Catholic, and Mary, Queen of Scots' presence in England from May 1568, provided a Catholic figurehead and alternative queen. Charles Neville, Earl of Westmoreland, and Thomas Percy, Earl of Northumberland, led the rising. When the Duke of Norfolk was arrested for plotting to marry Mary Queen of Scots, the Earls occupied Durham with 700 soldiers on November 14, 1569. They celebrated Catholic Mass at Durham Cathedral on November 30th, destroyed Protestant prayer books, and carried the banner of the 5 Wounds of Christ. Around 6,000 armed men assembled. But popular support never materialised. Royal forces marched with 22,000 men. On December 16th, the rebel earls retreated, their forces dispersed, and they fled to Scotland. The rebellion collapsed by Christmas. Elizabeth's response was merciless. She demanded at least 700 executions. Approximately 600 supporters were killed, the heaviest judicial death toll of any 16th century English rebellion. Victims were wholly of meanest sort of people. Hardly a village escaped public hanging. These were ordinary people pushing against a way of life that was being pushed on them that didn't benefit them. But Elizabeth was in a precarious position. If she was lenient to them, it would allow a crack in her armour that could be exploited by her cousin Mary. However, no middle ground was sought. Instead, Elizabeth made an example of them as a warning to other would-be Catholic uprisings in her kingdom. The Earl of Northumberland was beheaded at York on August 22, 1572, refusing to renounce his Catholic faith. The Earl of Westmoreland died impoverished in exile. The rebellion's failure convinced Pope Pius V in 1570 to excommunicate Elizabeth, also absolving her subjects from allegiance to her. The bull called her the pretended Queen of England and a slave of wickedness, and commanded people, do not dare obey her orders, mandates and laws. John Felton nailed a copy to the Bishop of London's door and was executed weeks later, becoming a Catholic martyr. The bull arrived too late and had no military backing. Both Philip II and the Holy Roman Emperor disagreed with the approach, but it created an impossible dilemma for Catholics, releasing them from allegiance while excommunicating any who obeyed Elizabeth's laws. The Ridolfi plot in 1571 demonstrated continuing danger. Roberto Ridolfi, a Florentine banker, conspired with Norfolk, Mary Queen of Scots, Philip II and the Pope to assassinate Elizabeth and invade England. Elizabeth's intelligence network infiltrated the plot. The Duke of Norfolk was executed June 1572, and Mary survived for now, although it was another mark against her. Elizabeth chose not to execute her at this time, though Parliament demanded it. Legislative response transformed Catholic persecution. The 1571 Acts made it treason to obtain papal bulls, or say Elizabeth wasn't the rightful queen. In 1581, the recusancy fine increased from 12 pence to £20 per month, a 4,000% increase, approximately 50 times an artisan's monthly wage. It became treason to be reconciled with Rome or to enter the country as a Catholic priest. Before 1570, persecution was primarily for nonconformity and poorly enforced. After 1570, Catholicism became synonymous with treason. By Elizabeth's death, Catholicism had collapsed from a majority religion to a faith confined largely to gentry households. The settlement was enforced through systematic violence that made Catholic survival a matter of wealth, geography, and luck. Elizabeth's early Ireland policy from 1558 to 1572 established patterns of violence and plantation that would define Anglo-Irish relations for centuries. Sir Henry Sidney, Lord Deputy from 1565, mounted campaigns against Shane O'Neill in Ulster, establishing English garrisons and converting clan territories into counties. His controversial cess, an annual military levy, caused major discontent. Sidney extended military severity over ordinary populace, not just opponents. He reportedly joked in letters about killing so many Irish varlets he had lost count. Plantation schemes largely failed. The enterprise of Ulster in the 1570s, privately funded, failed completely and sparked violent conflict. The policy of granting Irish lands to English adventurers intensified Irish hostility while achieving minimal settlement. Military violence targeted civilians systematically. Sidney's forces destroyed crops and livestock to starve rebel supporters, causing widespread famine. English policy by 1572 involved executing any Irishman found bearing arms. The English army rarely exceeded 1,000 men. Elizabeth was extremely reluctant to commit resources. Irish expenditure fluctuated between £35,000 to £70,000 annually. Elizabeth's chronic parsimony meant campaigns were consistently underfunded, leading to longer conflicts and escalating violence. The period demonstrated English forces could not decisively defeat Gaelic resistance without massive commitment that Elizabeth was unwilling to provide. Yet the brutality established precedents. Civilian targeting, starvation campaigns, and plantation as colonial strategy would intensify in subsequent decades, culminating in atrocities like the 1580 Smerwick massacre, 600 soldiers and civilians slaughtered after surrender. By 1572, Elizabeth had survived 14 years against extraordinary odds. She inherited a bankrupt kingdom with questioned legitimacy and religious chaos. She established a Protestant settlement that would endure centuries, crushed the greatest Catholic rebellion of her reign, navigated papal excommunication, thwarted foreign plots, and positioned England as an emerging power. The cost was measured in bodies, over 600 executed after the Northern Rebellion, escalating Catholic persecution, and early experiments in Irish colonial violence. By that time, Elizabeth had also established the patterns that would define her reign: strategic ambiguity, calculated violence, and the transformation of apparent weaknesses into sources of power. Her unmarried status became diplomatic leverage. Her gender, which counsellors saw as weakness, became the foundation for a political persona that transcended conventional categories. She survived because she learned survival from childhood. She thrived because she understood power is performance. It's often said that Elizabeth was less brutal than her father Henry VIII, less fanatical than her half-brother's regents under Edward VI, less bloody than her half-sister Mary I. And by raw numbers, this appears true. Mary publicly executed approximately 283 Protestants in just 4 years. Elizabeth publicly executed around 200 Catholics over 45 years. The maths seems to favour Elizabeth, but this comparison is dangerously misleading. Violence doesn't become acceptable simply because someone else committed more of it in full view. Mary's reign of terror lasted 4 years. Elizabeth's systematic persecution stretched across 4.5 decades, and many of those who died under Elizabeth's hand were hidden from the figures, collateral damage from her policies. Mary's victims were martyrs whose deaths shocked contemporaries and turned opinion against her. Elizabeth's victims were executed as traitors, their deaths legally justified and publicly celebrated. Mary's brutality was concentrated and obvious. Elizabeth's was bureaucratic, sustained, and wrapped in the language of law and national security. The Catholic community didn't just face execution, they faced financial ruin through crushing recusancy fines, social isolation, the constant threat of betrayal, and the slow starvation of their faith as priests were hunted down and killed. By Elizabeth's death, Catholicism had been systematically dismantled from a majority religion to a hidden sect. That wasn't just violence. It was the patient, methodical destruction of an entire community over 2 generations. The fact that it was less bloody than Mary's approach doesn't make it less devastating. It makes it more effective. Both sisters were still Tudors, and this was only the beginning. By 1572, Mary Queen of Scots was still alive, still in custody, still plotting, and still providing a focal point for every Catholic conspiracy. The papal bull excommunicating Elizabeth remained in force. Philip II of Spain was watching, waiting, and growing increasingly hostile. In Ireland, the brutal patterns of colonial warfare were just being established. The worst atrocities were yet to come. The golden age of Elizabethan culture, Shakespeare, Marlowe, the flowering of English literature, would unfold against a backdrop of escalating violence, paranoia, and a surveillance state that would make Walsingham's spy network the most sophisticated in Europe. Elizabeth had survived her first 14 years as queen, but the greatest challenges, the hardest decisions, and the darkest chapters of her reign still lay ahead. The final 3 decades of Elizabeth I's reign transformed England from a vulnerable Protestant kingdom into a formidable European power, but at a devastating cost measured in lives, treasure, and mounting domestic strain. While propaganda successfully crafted the image of Gloriana and the Spanish Armada's defeat became national legend, the period's defining reality was sustained colonial violence in Ireland that claimed over 100,000 lives through deliberate famine and scorched earth warfare, combined with systematic religious persecution, factional court intrigue, and wars that brought England to the brink of bankruptcy. This was not the golden age of myth. From 1572 onward, Elizabeth presided over systematic atrocities that many modern historians term genocidal in intent, executed Mary Queen of Scots in a carefully orchestrated spectacle of plausible deniability, survived multiple assassination plots and a naval superpower's repeated invasion attempts, and watched her final favourite mount an armed rebellion that required his execution. By 1603, England had survived, but the aging queen died isolated, the treasury exhausted, and the succession uncertain until her final breath. The saga of Mary Queen of Scots reached its inevitable bloody conclusion through Sir Francis Walsingham's sophisticated entrapment operation, a masterclass in espionage that would define intelligence work for centuries. In 1586, Walsingham's carefully selected double agent Gilbert Gifford established what Mary believed was a secure communication channel at Chartley Castle, letters hidden in beer barrels that Walsingham's cryptanalyst Thomas Philippes intercepted, painstakingly decoded, copied and resealed before delivery. The trap was exquisite in its design. Mary, desperate after 19 years of imprisonment, believed she had finally found a way to communicate with supporters undetected. When Anthony Babington's fateful letter arrived on July 6, 1586, detailing explicit plans to assassinate Elizabeth with 6 noble gentlemen, all my private friends, Mary's response on July 17th sealed her fate. She explicitly approved the plot. When all is ready, the 6 gentlemen must be set to work, and you will provide that on their design being accomplished, I may be myself rescued from this place. There is absolutely no doubt that Mary was guilty of treason regarding this specific plot. Although the moral complexity remains, Walsingham had deliberately created the communication channel to entrap her. After 19 years of increasingly harsh imprisonment, watching her health deteriorate and hopes fade, Mary had fallen into a carefully constructed trap. The forged postscript Philippes brazenly added to her letter, requesting the names of all conspirators, demonstrates the extent of manipulation involved. Yet Mary's authentic letter had clearly discussed the assassination without forbidding it, and under the terms of the Bond of Association, this alone sealed her fate. Her trial at Fotheringhay Castle on October 14th and 15th, 1586, was theatrical spectacle rather than judicial proceeding. Denied legal counsel, unable to call witnesses or even review the evidence against her, Mary nonetheless mounted a spirited and intelligent defence. She argued that English law had no jurisdiction over an anointed foreign queen who had come to England seeking sanctuary. The court of 36 carefully selected noblemen convicted her on October 25th. Elizabeth then delayed signing the death warrant for nearly 4 months, caught between political necessity and the unprecedented nature of executing an anointed queen. During this delay, Elizabeth attempted first to have Mary's jailer, Sir Amyas Pauly, murder her privately. He refused with admirable integrity, declaring he would not make a shipwreck of my conscience or shed blood without law and warrant. Only after this attempt failed did Elizabeth finally sign the warrant on February 1st, 1587, though she would later claim she never intended it to be used. The execution on February 8, 1587 was horrifically botched in a way that seemed to underscore the cosmic wrong of regicide. The executioner's first blow missed Mary's neck entirely, striking the back of her head as she prayed. Mary was heard to whisper, "Sweet Jesus." The second blow severed most, but not all of the neck. A third stroke with the axe was required to finish the grim task. When the executioner held up her head proclaiming, "God save the Queen," her auburn wig came away in his hand, revealing short grey hair beneath, the locks of a woman aged beyond her years by captivity. Her small dog, which had hidden in her blood-soaked petticoats throughout, emerged whimpering and had to be forcibly removed, dying soon after when it refused to eat. Mary was just 44 years old. Elizabeth's response combined genuine political calculation with masterful theatrical performance. She claimed the Privy Council had acted without her authorization, threw Secretary William Davison into the Tower for 19 months, though continued paying his salary and temporarily banished Cecil from court. Yet as historian John Guy demonstrates, this was carefully contrived plausible deniability. If Cecil covertly sealed the warrant and sent it to Fotheringhay behind her back, she could claim she had been the victim of a court conspiracy. The political theatre served real strategic purposes, giving Elizabeth diplomatic cover with Catholic powers while eliminating the focal point for every Catholic plot. Mary's son James VI of Scotland calmly accepted his mother's execution, having already secured his own succession prospects through secret negotiations and the Treaty of Berwick. But soon problems with Spain would arise again, and Mary's death only further fueled the fire. The enterprise of England represented Philip II's apocalyptic attempt to solve the Protestant problem through overwhelming military force, a crusade blessed by Pope Sixtus V, with promises of 1,000,000 ducats upon success. The armada that finally sailed from Lisbon on May 28, 1588, after multiple delays and setbacks, was made up of 130 ships carrying 30,000 men. But this impressive number concealed fatal weaknesses. Only 28 were purpose-built warships. The rest were hastily converted merchantmen and supply transports unsuited for naval combat. Most critically, only 88 to 100 artillery pieces aboard the entire fleet were big guns capable of actually sinking enemy ships. The rest were anti-personnel weapons useless in ship-to-ship combat. Philip II's fundamental strategic error was attempting to combine two incompatible plans simultaneously. The fleet must sail 1,000 miles from Spain through hostile waters, somehow coordinate with the Duke of Parma's 27,000 veteran troops waiting in Flanders, who had no secure communication method and no deep-water ports for the Armada to use, then ferry this army across the Channel to England while maintaining naval superiority. It was a plan that required everything to go perfectly, and nothing did. The Duke of Medina Sidonia, an aristocrat with extensive administrative experience, but absolutely no naval command background, had been Philip's desperate third choice after the experienced Marquis of Santa Cruz died and his second choice declined. Medina Sidonia achieved a remarkable feat, simply getting the unwieldy fleet to Calais largely intact. During the week-long running battle up the English Channel from July 29th to August 6th, only 3 Spanish ships were lost to English action despite constant harassment. The Spanish maintained their defensive crescent formation, a floating fortress against superior English gunnery and seamanship, frustrating English attempts to break their formation. Modern scholarship, particularly Geoffrey Parker and Colin Martin's definitive work, emphasizes that tactical and strategic failures rather than divine providence or weather determined the outcome. The decisive Battle of Gravelines on August 8, 1588, demonstrated devastating English tactical superiority earned through years of innovation. After English fireships broke the Spanish anchorage at midnight, causing panic as Spanish captains cut their anchor cables to escape, losing irreplaceable anchors, English warships closed to within speech of one another and poured concentrated fire into isolated Spanish vessels. Sir William Winter reported firing 500 rounds from his ship Vanguard alone, more ammunition than most Spanish ships carried in total. Spanish ships were said to be riddled with shot like a sieve, suffering nearly 2,000 casualties in hours before English ammunition ran out. The critical English advantage was technological revolution, not courage. John Hawkins's decade-long naval reformation had produced compact four-wheeled truck gun carriages, allowing rapid reloading in confined spaces. English guns could fire as fast as muskets, requiring just 4 men and 2.5 minutes per shot, versus Spanish field-type carriages needing 6 men and 5 minutes minimum. Spanish gunners expected to fire once, then board for hand-to-hand combat. English ships could stand off and maintain sustained bombardment for hours. This tactical revolution, combined with sleeker, race-built warship designs that sacrificed cargo capacity for speed and maneuverability, gave England the world's most effective battle fleet, despite being outnumbered. The weather's role, though dramatic, was contributory, not decisive. The August storms that devastated the Spanish return journey around Scotland and Ireland killed 5,000 to 10,000 men and destroyed 24 to 27 ships off Ireland alone. Yet these ships were vulnerable precisely because English action had weakened their hulls with hundreds of cannonball impacts. They had lost anchors during the fireship panic and couldn't ride out storms, provisions were depleted after months at sea, and crucially, Philip II's planning had arranged no secure harbours or supply depots. English combat losses were minimal. 0 ships lost, approximately 100 men killed in action, although at least 2,000 sailors died from typhus and dysentery while the fleet remained mobilised awaiting the Armada's possible return. The war, however, was far from over. Spain, learning from failure, launched 3 more invasion attempts. And in 1601, they succeeded in landing 3,500 veteran troops at Kinsale Island, nearly tipping O'Neill's rebellion to victory. The Anglo-Spanish War continued officially until the Treaty of London in 1604, costing England over £3.4 million and nearly bankrupting the realm despite victory. But Spain wasn't the only nation to feel the force of England's military experience, but the difference was this one was meant to be part of Elizabeth's kingdom, Ireland. Elizabeth's Irish policies evolved from attempted containment to systematic extermination, a transformation that would establish patterns of colonial violence replicated across the British Empire for centuries. Following the Northern Rebellion's suppression from 1569 in the north of England, methods emerged that would define England's approach to Ireland: terror as policy, famine as weapon, and civilian massacre as military strategy. Humphrey Gilbert's 1569 Munster campaign introduced these terror tactics with horrifying innovation, executing all found bearing arms regardless of age, then displaying their severed heads in rows, creating what witnesses called lanes of heads leading to his tent. Contemporary chronicler Thomas Churchyard recorded with disturbing approval, "He killed man, woman and child, and spoiled, wasted and burned, so that he left neither corn, nor horn, nor house unburnt. Mowers of grass or cutters of corn, none escaped." The First Desmond Rebellion from 1569 until 1573 saw these experimental tactics systematized into official policy. After crushing organised military resistance, English forces under Lord President Perrot deliberately destroyed all crops and cattle across entire regions, understanding that in pre-modern Ireland, this meant condemning the civilian population to death. Lord Justice Pelham reported with bureaucratic detachment about putting man, woman and child to the sword as standard operating procedure. The Second Desmond Rebellion in 1579 until 1583 escalated these policies dramatically. The Earl of Desmond, Gerald Fitzgerald, controlled Munster with approximately 3,000 soldiers and 20,000 active supporters from among the general population. Rather than simply defeating his forces militarily, Elizabeth's commanders chose to destroy the entire society that sustained them. The Smerwick massacre of November 10, 1580, shocked even 16th century sensibilities accustomed to brutal warfare. Lord Grey de Wilton captured Fort del Oro, containing 600 Spanish and Italian papal troops after a 3-day siege. Despite their negotiated surrender under a displayed white flag, the universal symbol of surrender, Grey ordered every soul executed. Captain Walter Raleigh and Officer Mackworth personally supervised the systematic slaughter that followed. Soldiers were beheaded in organised batches of 20, their heads piled in neat pyramids. Pregnant Irish women found in the fort were hanged from the walls. Grey later defended this atrocity by claiming they were no soldiers but rogues and vagabonds, lacking a sovereign's commission, a legal technicality used to justify mass murder. What followed in Munster was systematic destruction on a scale that defied comprehension. Lord President Perrot's 1584 survey found the population had dropped from approximately 300,000 to under 100,000 in just 4 years. Contemporary accounts describe apocalyptic scenes that haunted even hardened soldiers. Edmund Spenser, the celebrated poet who participated in the campaign and received 3,000 acres of confiscated land as reward, wrote with a mixture of horror and justification. Out of every corner of the woods and glens they came creeping forth upon their hands, for their legs would not bear them. They spoke like ghosts crying out of their graves. They did eat the dead carrions, happy where they could find them. The 9 Years' War in 1594 began when Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, united Gaelic resistance in an unprecedented alliance. O'Neill was no mere rebel, but a sophisticated military commander who had studied English tactics and understood both traditional Irish and modern continental warfare. Initial English disasters included the catastrophic defeat at Yellow Ford in August 1598, where 2,000 English soldiers died, the worst English military defeat in Ireland. Essex's 1599 expedition with 17,000 troops, The largest army Elizabeth ever sent anywhere failed completely through his incompetence and possible mental breakdown, contributing directly to his eventual execution. Lord Mountjoy's appointment in 1600 brought methodical scientific brutality. His strategy explicitly combined conventional military pressure with systematic famine creation through continuous crop destruction in a rolling campaign that gave civilians no time to recover. Sir Arthur Chichester, his subordinate, reported with evident distress, "We kill so many churls as it grieveth me to think that it is necessary to do this work." Fynes Morrison, Mountjoy's secretary, documented scenes that belonged more to apocalypse than warfare. No spectacle was more frequent in the ditches of towns and especially in wasted countries than to see multitudes of these poor people dead, with their mouths all coloured green by eating nettles, docks and all things they could rend up above ground. The war's end came through mutual exhaustion. English forces suffered 30,000 dead, mostly from disease, costing £2 million. Irish losses exceeded 100,000. Predominantly civilians deliberately starved or systematically slaughtered. O'Neill's submission came March 30th, 1603, just 6 days after Elizabeth's death, though he didn't yet know she had died. Modern historians' assessments are uniformly damning. Nicholas Canny, the preeminent historian of early modern Ireland, termed these campaigns genocidal in intent by any reasonable definition. David Edwards concluded the violence was both instrumental and ideological, intended to clear the land for English Protestant settlers. Contemporary Spanish captain Francisco de Cuellar, shipwrecked after the Armada, wrote, "These English, who are all Lutheran heretics, are great enemies of the Catholic faith, have no mercy with anyone." But Elizabeth's final conflict would be closer to home and her heart. Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, represented Elizabeth's final attempt at recapturing youth through a favourite 34 years her junior. Stepson to Leicester, tall, charismatic and impulsive, Essex combined genuine military capability with dangerous political naivete and possible bipolar disorder. His 1596 Cadiz expedition succeeded brilliantly, capturing Spain's principal Atlantic port, destroying 34 ships and securing a £120,000 ransom. Yet the 1597 Azores expedition failed through poor planning. Essex's rivalry with Robert Cecil intensified as the Queen aged. His catastrophic 1599 Irish command, abandoning campaign to negotiate secretly with O'Neill, then deserting his post, triggered his downfall. He famously burst into Elizabeth's bedchamber on September 28, 1599, finding her without wig or makeup, which shattered her royal mystique. Elizabeth was a woman who had kept tight control over how she was presented to everyone: enemies, ordinary people, courtiers. Essex's arrogant intrusion reminded her how dangerously close she had allowed him in. House arrest, loss of monopolies, and mounting debt of £16,000 drove his desperation, and it wasn't long before he attempted to rebel against Elizabeth herself. The rebellion on February 8, 1601, 300 followers attempting to seize court, collapsed within hours. His trial on February 19th was predetermined, and execution on February 25th followed. Elizabeth reportedly never recovered, keeping his final letter in her possession. Psychologically, executing Essex represented executing her younger self's romantic possibilities. Elizabeth's final years saw mounting isolation. The so-called Second Reign from 1587 until her death was characterised by her closest advisors' deaths: Dudley in 1588, Walsingham in 1590, Hatton in 1591, and Burghley in 1598. Enormous Irish war drain on the treasury finances, and the ageing Queen becoming increasingly isolated. The problem that had hovered in the background for Elizabeth's entire reign was now the paramount issue: who was going to succeed her throne? Multiple potential heirs created uncertainty. There was James VI with the strongest claim, but also Arbella Stuart through the Stuart line, and Edward Seymour, descended through the line of Mary Tudor, Elizabeth's aunt. Elizabeth refused naming anyone, leaving Robert Cecil, the son of William, who had since died, with no choice but to secretly negotiate with James from 1601. In January 1603, Elizabeth retreated to Richmond Palace. The Countess of Nottingham's death on February 24th triggered her final decline. She refused food, stood for hours on cushions, told Cecil, "Must is not a word to use to princes, little man." She died peacefully in the early hours of March 24th, 1603, aged 69. When asked about James inheriting, no longer able to speak, she reportedly gestured a crown around her head to indicate her agreement. Within hours, Cecil proclaimed James I as king. The transition was remarkably peaceful. Elizabeth's refusal to name an heir, seemingly dangerous, prevented civil war. This represented her final political masterstroke. Elizabeth's final 3 decades achieved national survival against overwhelming odds. England repelled Spanish invasion, maintained Protestant identity, secured Scottish alliance, crushed Irish rebellion, and emerged as significant European power with revolutionary naval capability. Yet the costs were catastrophic. Over 100,000 Irish people died, mostly civilians, through deliberate famine, contemporary descriptions of cannibalism, children eating dead mothers, populations dying with mouths green from grass. While much of these accounts were likely exaggerated for the purposes of justifying the otherness of Irish society, there had to be truth behind such brutal descriptions, and they became the blueprint for centuries of calculated policy for British colonisation. But equally, the financial exhaustion was severe. £5 million spent on wars against £392,000 of annual revenue nearly bankrupted England. Elizabeth's evolution from confident young queen to isolated monarch who possibly broke a lady's finger in rage, refused mirrors, believed her propaganda, and died tormented by ghosts reveals power's psychological toll. The Gloriana cult became a prison, the mask she couldn't remove even in death. The smooth succession vindicated Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary's blood, and not Elizabeth's, flows through subsequent British monarchs. Elizabeth was a woman tormented by her childhood, the threats of assassination, and the pressures of holding the throne alone. It's easy to paint her as something black and white, either the Golden Gloriana inspiring her soldiers to defend her kingdom and devoted only to her country rather than a husband, or as a ruthless tyrant cutting down any who threatened her existence, even her own cousin Mary. But the truth is more complicated, as Elizabeth was both. On the one hand, it's difficult for us to judge her because she was in an unprecedented position, and a lesser monarch might have crumbled under the weight of being queen. She lived through a time of change and conflict, when what would become the modern age started trying to push through in bloody and violent ways. At the same time, Elizabeth was well aware of the atrocities carried out under her orders and in her name, and we cannot ignore that she was happy for these to happen. But unlike the previous Tudors in her family, she understood how to use propaganda to full effect, how to hide information she didn't want to be public knowledge, and how to blind people through the brilliance of her cult. But Elizabeth kept England independent and Protestant, a goal that was pushed and desired by her court and advisors from the very beginning, but at a price measured in Irish corpses, Catholic priests disemboweled, soldiers dying in bogs, and crown lands sold for wars achieving limited gains. Behind Gloriana's mask was a brilliant, temperamental woman who made ruthless decisions, presided over systematic atrocities, survived through political genius and stubbornness, and died having saved England but left it exhausted. Her reign's final decades weren't golden, but a grinding struggle where England won and many paid the price. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.